Today, we're going to be asking the question, do artists cause gentrification? And I know that's a bit clickbaity, but I've got to get you in. Basically, what I'm going to be asking is, what are the causes of gentrification? How does it happen? And what role do artists play in that process? And I guess the reason I'm interested in this is because as a young white middle class artist, I have lived in neighborhoods which are changing quite a lot, like Peckham or Brixton, and I've been quite aware of the fact that my presence may not be entirely positive in these spaces. And I guess on some level I felt kind of guilty about that, but also if I'm quite frank, before I started researching this video, I didn't really understand gentrification. I knew it had something to do with hipsters moving to an area and expensive coffee shops turning up and luxury housing being built on top of affordable housing and evictions. But that's parts of it, but I didn't really know how it all came together. And that kind of interests me. And I guess on one level, maybe it interests me because I feel like I fall into it. I don't know, but I'm not trying to absolve myself of gentrification sins. I recognize that to a level I was complicit in moving to those spaces, but I just want to know what actually is gentrification, how does it work, and what extent do artists trigger that process? So what actually is gentrification? Well, according to MIT professor Philip Clay, gentrification has 4 stages. Stage 1, pioneering individuals move into a low-income area, unsupported by any governments or institutions. No one's really bothered, no one pays that much attention, and a lot of the time these pioneering individuals are artists or bohemians or part of a queer scene. Phase 2. More people become interested in the area because of the initial changes that have taken place and word of mouth, people talking about this new upcoming area. Individuals who have a bit more money start buying up property in this area. Some of them actually move there and take part in the community and the culture. Other people literally buy the property just to flip it later and make profit once the space is gentrified. And at this point, the media starts paying attention and labeling an area the new Brooklyn or the new Shoreditch. In phase 3, the middle class gentrifiers and the new businesses which have moved into this area start taking on a much more prominent role within the community. Banks begin lending more in these areas, developers go hard, police and security forces are increased to make sure new residents feel safe and that their wealth is protected, and a tension builds up between the old lower income residents and the new higher income residents. In phase 4, an already gentrified area becomes even more expensive. Managerial professionals come in, artists, bohemians, and hangers-on from the earlier phases have to leave. Properties which were held vacant by developers are finally sold off as luxury flats. Rampant eviction takes place of older, more lower income residents, and the gentrification process starts spilling over into neighbouring areas. I find Philip Clay's 4 stages really interesting and informative, and I like how specifically he addresses artists, bohemians, and the queer scene as a sort of entity in that process. But he kind of focuses on the how of gentrification, but doesn't really answer the why it happens. And I read this book called How to Kill a City by P.E. Moskowitz, and I actually recommend this book to everyone. It was really, really interesting and explained using references from the United States how gentrification happens in a lot of detail. It was absolutely fascinating, and connecting it to racism and imperialism and white flight in the suburbs and geography. It was fascinating. I highly recommend it. Anyway, Moskowitz breaks down the why really well. They explain in the book that property has 2 functions. It's something that people live in, but it's also an asset that generates profit. And gentrification starts taking place when a property's profit value is prioritized over the needs of the people who live in that space. And in practice, what that looks like is aggressive racist evictions of certain lower income tenants in order to redo the houses, create luxury flats, and bring in rich people who can pay a lot more rent. And it looks like councils deciding to build more luxury flats despite the fact that a lot of people need affordable homes. And what you'll notice is artists, bohemians, and the queer scene turn up in the how of gentrification, but we're not too involved in the why of gentrification. And I think that's really interesting because we do play a role, clearly. Everyone associates artists with areas being gentrified, but we're not the main drivers, nor are we necessarily the people profiting from the processes. I feel like it's kind of a chicken and egg situation because on the one hand, when artists come to an area, it seems like they inevitably attract hipsters and yuppies and higher income people to that area, therefore triggering the gentrification process. But you could kind of flip this argument and say that artists are generally kind of precarious financially, they're very mobile, and they're insecurely housed. So artists are constantly going to be moving around urban areas looking for cheap spaces to exist within. So it could be one of two things. Either artists are moving in, making a space seem more attractive and bringing in higher income residents, or artists are just out there looking for the best deal possible. And unfortunately, that's also the spaces which are most profitable for developers to gentrify, meaning that they're kind of a canary in the coal mine. But I'm not trying to let artists off the hook entirely because art galleries, graffiti exists in every single gentrified space in the Western world, and there must be a reason for that. Developers know that yuppies and hipsters and people with nice incomes want to live in artsy spaces or whatever, and will literally invest in artist studios or street art or galleries in order to create that sort of trendy vibe, which does push prices up and pay back tenfold. And there's actually a name for this process. It's called art washing, and it's basically a way of grooming a space to be gentrified. So artists and galleries can definitely become pawns in the gentrification process. And I think there's only one way that we can definitely make sure that our creative powers aren't used to this end, and that is by being community focused and politicized, which we should be anyway. But if we're not those things, we are very vulnerable to just accepting any offer possible from any big money gallery and not really thinking about the way in which that gallery is interacting with the space. A good example of this is the Arcadia Missa Gallery, who actually moved from Peckham into central London because they were very conscious that they were playing a negative role in the community in Peckham, pushing the gentrification process forward. Also, to say that all artists cause gentrification is definitely a generalization. And I know I wrote the title, but I wrote that title because people say it and I'm trying to get clicks here, so it has to be clickbaity. But I think most of the time when we make a statement like artists cause gentrification, what we're imagining in our head is white, wealthy artists who are supported by their parents and can just live wherever they want. But actually, that's not really fair. They're just the most visible and supported artists and the ones who think about the most because they get the most representation in the long run. There are artists from every class and ethnicity out there. So because for every rich parent-backed artist who moves into an area, a lower income artist who's lived there for a long time is probably going to have to leave as the rents rise, which suggests that it's not about culture or about art or about galleries. It's about who can afford to live here. And it's just that the person who leaves is probably leaving quite quietly, whereas the new kind of obnoxious artists in the area are highly visible and drinking all this bougie coffee and in these bougie bars, and everyone sees them as these massive red flags when areas becoming more expensive. They are not. That's it. The way I see it, artists are kind of like surfers, surfing on the wave of gentrification. So they need a cheap urban space to live in, and They get there, and as rent rises, they move on to the next cheap place, rent rises, and they just keep surfing that wave. However, you've also got some artists who are slightly more well off who don't need to surf a wave because they're on a boat. They'll just rise with the tide. And I think one of the most important and key things that us as artists need to remember is to be politicized enough and community-minded enough not to allow our work to become part of a art washing process, not to accept offers to work with galleries or councils who are looking to gentrify areas, even though that's a really hard thing to say no to if you're a broke artist and you need the money and you need the exposure. But I think that's where our creative power lies, in deciding what we associate with and how we interact with an area. Anyway, these are just my ideas. Let me know what you think down below. Have I missed anything? Would you disagree with anything? Thanks for watching.